All right, today we're going to be looking at multiplying complex numbers. There's just one set of rules that we need to remember when multiplying complex numbers. So let's recall a complex number is a number with this, specifically, I want to say a number with this imaginary part. So if we have the square root of a -1, okay, we would take the negative out, and this would become I times the square root of 1, and the square root of 1 is just 1. So the square root of -1 is just I. So that's how we come up with this imaginary number, what we call a complex number. Now there are 4 different phases that we need to be aware of, but mainly the second condition. So we're going to talk about different terms of I. So we could possibly have I squared. We could have I to the 3rd power. We could have I to the 4th. Okay, this I squared is going to be the most important. Okay, so let's talk about where that comes from. Okay, so an I squared will be the same thing as saying the square root of -1 squared, because that's where it comes from. Okay, square root and square cancel each other out. Okay, so you just end up with a -1. So therefore, I squared is equal to -1. So this is one of the terms that you need to remember. So square root of -1 is just I. There's no other interpretation. It's just I. When we get to I squared, that is equal to -1. Okay, you can kind of see where it comes from. And then the same thing, if we did I cubed, let's find out what that equals. So that would be the same as saying the square root of -1 to the 3rd power. Okay, so from math standpoint, we know that raising something to the 3rd power is multiplying it times itself 3 times. So instead, I'm going to split this up. I'm going to split it up into the square root of -1 squared, and then times the square root of -1. Okay, previously we have talked about both of these. Okay, so this is 2 plus 1 gives us 3. The property of exponents. Okay, whenever we do the square root of -1, okay, that gives us I squared, or just -1. So this part is equal to -1. This is equal to I. So what we're looking at is -1 times I from these two parts here. Okay, that was -1 from here, and this was I from the first part. So when we multiply these two together, I cubed is the same thing as saying -I. Okay, that's another interpretation of it. So that's what that's equal to. So I cubed is equal to -I. Okay, so this is another term we want to know. And then when we get to the 4th power, okay, the simple way of thinking of that is just saying square root of -1 squared times the square root of -1 squared again, because 2 plus 2 gives us 4. And the square root of -1 squared, which we previously talked about, is -1. So what we get here is -1 times -1. And negative times a negative equals positive. So I to the 4th just equals +1. Okay, so these are the 4 stages of I that we need to remember. When you get to I to the 5th power, it just starts over. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, and then 5, 6, 7, 8, and it just keeps cycling through these 4 stages. So in the event that we need to know like I to the 25th power, we can just kind of do some properties and we'll be able to figure that out. Okay, so now that we have a better understanding of that, we're going to evaluate problem number 1. Okay, so problem number 1 says the square root of -25 times the square root of -81. Okay, you want to treat these square root symbols as grouping symbols, kind of like parentheses or brackets or something of that nature. You cannot simply multiply first. If you did, you would get rid of the negatives, because negative times a negative is a positive, and you won't even know that you had a complex number here. So we can't just multiply first. You have to treat this as a grouping symbol. So we have to first break down the square root part. So this is going to give us imaginary, and the square root of 25 is 5. So this will give us 5i. And then over here, the square root of 81 is 9, but we have a negative inside, so there will be an I. So this will give us 9i. Okay, so once we've broken down those grouping symbols, now we can multiply these two terms. The way you multiply these is you do number times number and variable times variable. So 5 times 9 will give us 45, and then I times I will give us I squared. All right, now we got to go back. What does I squared mean? Okay, what is the interpretation of I squared? Well, I squared is equal to -1. Okay, so we're going to rewrite this as 45 times -1, which will give us a -45.